Hello everyone, and welcome to your last lesson of content for Grade 8 History World War I. Today you will be looking at the end of World War I and the treaties.
If you look at the average history textbook, the end of World War I isn't really covered all that much. It's usually boiled down to a catchy phrase. On the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, the war to end all wars was over. Of course, the reality of the situation wasn't nearly as neat and orderly as that saying would have you believe. After all, organizing a global ceasefire is rather a complex affair, especially when you don't have the luxury of instant communication. That's why the armistice went into effect a full 5 hours after it had been signed. Now, you'd imagine that during those crucial 5 hours, most soldiers would be hunkering down and nervously counting down the minutes. And that is indeed what some were doing. However, not everyone was just waiting around passively. In fact, these final hours of the First World War saw a flurry of action across all fronts, sometimes continuing to the very last minute. To understand why, it's worth pointing out that an armistice isn't a peace treaty, so it doesn't technically end a war. Many on the side of the Allies were worried that Germany would use the ceasefire as a stalling tactic. What they didn't know was that in early November 1918, Germany wasn't even remotely entertaining such a notion, for it was on the brink of collapse. After years of blockades and shortages, the German military was a shattered force. Soldiers and sailors openly disobeyed their orders to attack. Some deserted, while others banded together and instigated revolution. Inspired by the success of the Bolsheviks in Russia, these revolutionaries created soldier councils across Germany in an attempt to create their own Soviet republics. Now, of course, the Allies weren't aware of this, so to ensure against bad faith negotiations, many commanders pushed on with their plans even after learning of the impending ceasefire. The commander of the American forces on the Western Front did exactly that. In a letter to the Allied War Council, he advised against an armistice, arguing that only an unconditional surrender would be enough to prevent Germany from ever rising up again. His warnings were ignored, and we all know how that turned out. Yet, nevertheless, he pushed to gain as much ground as possible in the final hours of the war. Unsurprisingly, this resulted in the last casualty of the war being an American, as the 313th Infantry Regiment assaulted a small village in Lorraine. Some soldiers took this fight-to-the-last-minute order more seriously than others. A certain Henry Gunther, who had recently been demoted from sergeant to private, tried to prove his valiance by charging a German machine gun position by himself. The German soldiers on the other side tried to shoo him away, but when he didn't relent, they shot him, exactly 1 minute before the armistice was to take effect, at 10:59 a.m. Of course, this incident was far from isolated. In fact, the final day of the war saw over 10,000 casualties. And it wasn't just the Americans attacking either. The 231st Brigade from Britain, for example, was planning to assault a vital bridge along the Dendre River when they learned of the impending armistice. They then received new orders. They had an hour and a half to capture the bridge. They were successful, but most likely because their opponents didn't really put up a fight. Understandably. The situation on the Austro-Italian front was a similar story. Their armistice had been signed on November 3rd, with a full 24-hour forewarning, leaving the Italians plenty of time to push into enemy territory. Now, it's worth noting that although these advances weren't made with the intent of killing enemy combatants, they still saw plenty of ammunition being fired. We know from the memoirs of numerous artillerymen that they were encouraged to fire their shells liberally, with the end result being that they wouldn't have to haul them all the way back home. Thus, the final hours of World War I were full of a lot of fake fights, and some real ones, during which Henry Gunther and 2,000 other men lost their lives. It was all rather pointless at the end of the day, but on the bright side, at least Private Gunther was re-promoted to sergeant posthumously, for all that's worth. Well, my dear friends, don't go to war, don't start a war, spread peace and love and harmony and all that. While this was a gloomy adventure, I hope you nevertheless enjoyed learning about it. If you did, I'd appreciate it if you'd share it around with your friends and gave it a like, or dare I say it, if you became a patron on Patreon. Ah, yes, we would love you forever. In any case, we shall meet again in another 2 weeks for the next cynically instructive episode of Side Quest.
The end of the war. In 1916, the Germans began a determined effort to capture strategic French forts surrounding Verdun. This led to 6 months of heavy fighting and devastating losses. The British Army came to assist a severely weakened French army by attacking the German trenches at the Somme. In total, 1.25 million men were killed. This led to public outrage, and for the first time, the military leadership was being criticized. It seemed to be a military disaster, but there were some important consequences. The British had tried out new weapons and artillery tactics. This included the tank, the creeping barrage, and artillery ambush, which would serve them well in the future. Also, the German losses were huge, and they lost their best soldiers and officers. Some historians believe that the Battle of Verdun and the Battle of Somme were the turning points in the war. Yet in 1917, the war was still in a state of stalemate. Neither side could win, yet either side was ready to make peace. Now remember that tension between the USA and Germany was growing, as the USA was claiming to be neutral, but was clearly supplying loans and equipment to the Allies. The Germans introduced a policy of unrestricted submarine warfare on American ships, which included any ships they felt were carrying supplies as well as passengers. When Germany suggested allying with Mexico against America, it was the final straw, and on the 1st of April 1917, the USA declared war on Germany. We also had the Russian Revolution. Remember, this happened in 1917, and a year later, the new communist government made peace with Germany. So Germany no longer had to worry about Russia. So the Germans now launched a final enormous attack on France before many American troops arrived, but they could not break through. Back in Germany, people had had enough of the war, and food shortages were so bad that they were starving. So Britain and its allies, with its well-fed and well-equipped troops, took the opportunity to counterattack on much of the Western Front. They began to push the German army back. The German Emperor, Kaiser Wilhelm, fled from the country, and the government which replaced him asked for an armistice. An armistice means to cease fire, to stop fighting.
In the Battle of Verdun, the longest battle of the Great War, 2 countries fought tirelessly for 10 months on a battlefield of less than 10 square kilometers. Planned by the Chief of Staff of the German Army, General Erich von Falkenhayn, it was a battle of attrition, whose initial purpose was not necessarily to win, but rather to drain the French army of manpower and resources. If France fell, surely the collapse of her closest ally, Great Britain, would not be far behind. Situated 150 miles east of Paris along the banks of the Meuse River, Verdun was a garrison town, surrounded by impenetrable hills and a double ring of fortresses. Although Verdun was a crucial stronghold on France's eastern border, The French command had deemed it an unlikely target and had stripped its turrets of guns and its tunnels of manpower, a miscalculation that the French would sorely regret for generations. Armed with 1,200 guns and 1 million troops, and led by Crown Prince Willem, the Germans launched a massive artillery bombardment against France's front line on February 21st. After 9 deafening hours, they had successfully forced the French to retreat from their first and second line of trenches. After hearing reports of the battle, French headquarters appointed General Philippe Pétain as commander-in-chief of Verdun. Pétain insisted that there be no more retreats and ordered additional troops and ammunition to the Verdun region. The German advance was temporarily halted at the end of February, but resumed again in early March, when aiming to capture Le Mort-Homme, they instead took Côte 304. The French held on to the strategic site of Le Mort-Homme until the Germans seized it in a costly battle in late May. And on July 7th, Fort Vaux fell into German hands after a long siege and a heroic show of resistance from the French. The German attacks continued through the summer and early fall. Their scale, however, was reduced because some of the troops were diverted to their front lines at Somme to defend against the British assault. Empowered, perhaps, by the weakened German force, the French launched a series of counterattacks, and under the command of General Charles Maguin, they recaptured the forts at Domont and Vaux in November. Over the next 6 weeks, the French gained significant ground. On December 11th and December 13th, they advanced in a final victorious push to force the Germans to fully retreat. According to General von Falkenhayn, his intent for this battle was to bleed the French army white. Indeed, nearly 550,000 French men perished while defending Verdun. On December 19, 1916, the German army, having suffered approximately 434,000 casualties, finally turned away from the battlefields of Verdun and trudged on in a war that would continue for nearly 3 more years. Even when it was clear that there would be no decisive victory in the Battle of Verdun, both sides, without any strategic justification, fought to the bitter end to tire their enemy and prove their might.
So now the war is over, and we need to put some peace treaties in place to try and make sure this type of thing doesn't happen again. Well, that was the purpose anyway. So in 1919, the leaders of the victorious powers met in Paris to decide how to deal with the defeated powers. The leaders of Britain, France, and America found it hard to agree on what to do. There were 5 treaties drawn up at the Paris Peace Conference in Versailles. The main one was the Treaty of Versailles, which dealt with Germany. The other treaties dealt with Germany's allies. All the important decisions on the fate of Germany were taken by the Big Three. These were the leaders of Britain, France, and America. We had Clemenceau, who was French, Lloyd George, who was British, and Wilson, who was American. They got on badly from the start, and relations got worse throughout the conference, especially between Clemenceau and Wilson, who was very ill during parts of the conference. They couldn't agree on certain things with regards to how Germany should be treated. So let me introduce you to the Big Three. We have Woodrow Wilson, who was the President of the United States of America. You don't need to know when they were born or what they did in their backgrounds, but it is important to understand their character. Wilson was known as an idealist and a reformer. He wanted positive change. He campaigned against corruption in politics and business. In the beginning, he concentrated on keeping the United States out of the war. But once the United States had joined the war, he drew up what was known as the 14 points, which you will learn about later on in this video. We then have David Lloyd George, who was the Prime Minister of Britain. He was a realist, which is the opposite of an idealist. He was an experienced politician, and he knew there would need to be some form of compromise. He wanted to try and find a halfway point between what Wilson wanted and what Clemenceau wanted. George Clemenceau was the Prime Minister of France. Now remember, France took the hardest hit with regards to Germany and the Western Front. They also had some issues with Germany in the past. So he was a tough politician with a reputation for being uncompromising. So he didn't want to find a middle ground. He had seen his country invaded twice by Germany, and he was determined to not allow devastation to come again. And this is why the three of them could not agree on everything. The one wanted peace and treaties and trade and economic growth and wanted all the countries involved in the war to recover. The other one wanted to try and find middle ground. There should be some kind of punishment, but everyone should recover in the end. And finally, the last one just wanted to punish and did not want to allow for there to be healing or the chance for things to happen again. So there was no compromise, no forgiveness. And unfortunately, this is what led to World War II in the end.
Part 1. The aims at the Paris Peace Conference. This photograph shows Allied officials and soldiers struggling to see the signing of the Treaty of Versailles in 1919. What we cannot see in this picture is the reaction of the German delegation who claimed the treaty was unfair. In 1919, not many people were listening to German voices. As this poster from the time shows, the Allied leaders were under pressure from their own people to make Germany pay for the damage and suffering of the war. The leaders themselves had little interest in seeing Germany recover either. Each of the Allied leaders had their own views on the treaty. The US leader, President Woodrow Wilson, wanted a treaty based on his 14 points. He's generally seen as a moderate who wanted Germany punished, but not so harshly that it would want revenge. In contrast, the French Prime Minister Clemenceau was anxious that Germany should be crushed. France had suffered huge casualties in the war and wanted to make sure Germany did not recover its strength. In the middle ground was the British leader David Lloyd George. He believed Germany should be punished, but he also wanted Germany to recover. Before the war, Germany was the second biggest market for British goods, and Lloyd George wanted that trade back, as it meant British jobs and prosperity. The leaders and their teams of officials soon found that they had different priorities and would have to compromise. Wilson felt that Lloyd George and Clemenceau were more eager to achieve gains for their countries than to build a future peace. Lloyd George disliked Wilson's views on self-determination that might threaten British rule in India and the rest of the British Empire. Clemenceau was angry that the other two leaders were reluctant to limit Germany's power in Europe. These British cartoons suggested that most British people agreed with him.
The main treaty that everyone remembers from World War I was the Treaty of Versailles. The Treaty of Versailles was very harsh on Germany, as most countries felt that Germany had started the war, and so should pay for all the destruction created. Kind of strange, hey, considering it was Austria that started the war. All the economies, except America's, were exhausted and had lost most of their young men. Furthermore, the Germans had been extremely harsh with the Russians in the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in 1918. They stripped Russia of large amounts of land and 25% of its population. The Germans complained bitterly at the time that the treaty was totally unfair. The war was over, but the bitterness, hatred, and enmity between the warring countries was far from over. The leaders disagreed on the aims of the conference. Some felt it was to punish Germany, while others felt the aim was to cripple Germany so it would never be able to start another war. Many felt that the point of the conference was to reward the winning countries, while others felt that it was to establish a just and lasting peace. Germany reacted with horror as it lost 10% of its land, all its overseas colonies, 12.5% of its population, and 16% of its coal fields, and half of its iron and steel industry. This really hit their economy hard. Its army, which used to be mighty, was reduced to 100,000 men. They were not allowed to build an army of more than 100,000 soldiers. They were no longer allowed to have an air force and only a tiny navy. But they felt that the worst thing was that they had to accept all the blame for the war. Now, is that really fair? Additionally, most Germans did not understand how bad Germany's military situation was at the end of the war, and were outraged at not being invited to the Paris Peace Conference to negotiate peace. Yes, that is true. During all the treaties, Germany was not invited. So, they refused to sign the Treaty of Versailles at first. But the German leader, Ebert, knew that any resistance would lead to absolute obliteration of his people. So he reluctantly accepted the terms and signed the treaty on the 28th of June, 1919. The Big Three, who we've already discussed, were also not satisfied with the treaty. Clements, who was French, felt that it was not harsh enough. Lloyd George, who was British, returned home as a hero, but later described the treaty as a great pity and indicated that he believed another war would happen because of it. Wilson, who was American, was very disappointed with the treaty. He said that if he were a German, he would not have signed it. Some historians have taken a different view, pointing out how hard a task it was to agree on the terms, and suggest that the treaty was the best that could be hoped for in the circumstances. This treaty was to play a large role in the build-up to World War II. A closer look at the terms of the Treaty of Versailles.
The Treaty of Versailles, 1919. The terms of the Treaty of Versailles can be divided into three groups: territorial, military, and financial and economic. Here are some of the territorial terms. Alsace-Lorraine was returned to France. Germany was forbidden to unite with Austria. Lands in East Germany, including the farmlands of Posen and the Polish corridor between East Germany and East Prussia, were given to Poland. The Saar, which had rich coal fields, were given to France for 15 years. All Germany's colonies were taken and given to France and Britain as mandates. Here are some of the military terms. The German army was restricted to only 100,000 men. The Navy could now only have 6 battleships and no submarines, and there was to be no air force allowed. The Rhineland was demilitarized. This meant the German army could not go to this area between France and Germany. For the financial and economic terms, Germany would have to pay reparations, which would eventually be set at an enormous 132 billion gold marks. On top of this, Germany was not allowed to join the League of Nations, and it had to accept responsibility for causing all the damage and loss by the war. Overall, the Treaty of Versailles was unpopular with Germany and its creators. Its terms would go on to be reversed by Germany in both secret and in the open by Hitler and help cause World War II. Watch our other videos to learn more. Get your copy of Simple History World War I, available on Amazon now.
So earlier on, you heard that Woodrow had his 14 points. This was his idealistic approach. This was his hope and his dreams for the world. He wanted no secret treaties. He wanted access to the seas in peacetime or wartime, free trade between countries, that all countries work towards disarmament. Colonies should have a say in their own future. The German troops should leave Russia, and Belgium should have their independence. Alsace-Lorraine should go back to France, and the frontier between Austria and Italy needed to be adjusted. He believed in the self-determination for the peoples of Eastern Europe, meaning that they should be allowed to rule themselves. He believed that Serbia should have access to the sea, and the self-determination for the people in the Turkish Empire. Poland should become an independent state with access to the sea. And he also believed in the formation of the League of Nations.
The 14 points. On January 8, 1918, President Woodrow Wilson delivered his famous 14-point speech, where he outlined a plan to end World War I and secure world peace. When the war broke out in 1914, Wilson adopted a policy of neutrality, with no intention of involving the U.S. in a foreign war. But the U.S. couldn't remain isolated for long. In January 1917, British intelligence intercepted and decoded a message, known as the Zimmermann telegram, in which Germany asked Mexico to ally with them against the United States. Then, on February 1st of the same year, Germany announced unrestricted submarine warfare and started sinking merchant and passenger ships with U.S. citizens on board, something they had agreed not to do after sinking the Lusitania in 1915. The Lusitania, a British ocean liner, was torpedoed without warning, leading to the deaths of over 1,100 people, including 128 Americans. This was the final straw. On April 2, 1917, President Woodrow Wilson went before a joint session of Congress to request a declaration of war against Germany. Just 2 days later, on April 4th, Congress declared war. The war was brutal and expensive. In a little under 2 years of fighting, the U.S. had spent $32 billion and lost over 116,000 men. Wilson wanted the war to end. But when announcing his 14 points in January of 1918, Wilson didn't just want to end the war to protect America, he hoped to prevent wars from ever happening again. So together with his advisor and friend, Colonel Edward M. House, President Wilson organized a group of 150 political and social scientists to study Allied and American policy all over the globe, collecting nearly 2,000 reports and 1,200 maps. This would inform the idealistic 14 points, which would address causes of the World War and also propose solutions to ensure world peace in the future through policy and negotiations. 8 of the 14 points were aimed at resolving specific territorial issues among the countries involved in combat, and securing borders and statehood for Italy, the Turkish part of the Ottoman Empire, Poland, and Austria-Hungary. 5 points covered general principles for a peaceful world: open treaties and agreements, freedom of the seas, free trade, reduction of armaments, and adjustment of colonial claims to land. These were all based on the principles of self-determination, the idea that nations should have the right to govern themselves without interference from other countries. The 14th and most influential point proposed that countries form an alliance to guarantee the political independence and territorial integrity of great and small states alike. The 14-point speech reflected a tradition of diplomatic idealism that would come to define Wilson's presidency. But how did that idealism translate into action? Well, most of Wilson's points were never fully realized. But one point in particular would have a big impact on the Treaty of Versailles and the end of World War I. When the Allies met in Versailles to create a treaty to end the war, They were less interested in Wilson's idealistic vision and more interested in regaining what they had lost and punishing Germany. To Wilson's disappointment, the points were barely integrated and only to the benefit of the Allies. Most of them weren't actually adopted or honored by anyone after the treaty was signed. However, the 14th point was incorporated, the creation of a world organization providing collective security. This would later be known as the League of Nations. Ironically, despite a campaign from Wilson, the US never actually joined the League of Nations. And Wilson foreshadowed that without American membership in the League, there would be another world war within a generation. Sure enough, World War II would break out just 20 years later.
And so to summarize, the Great War ends.
It wasn't a fighter plane, a tank, or a battleship that spelled the end of the First World War, but a signature in a train carriage made on November 11th, 1918. By the second half of 1918, Germany was in big trouble. It had defeated Russia, but it was losing in France. German forces were being pushed back, and its leaders no longer believed they could win the war. Defeat was coming. One by one, Germany's allies, including Bulgaria, the Ottoman Empire, and Austria-Hungary, pulled out of the fighting and signed formal agreements to stop the conflict. That's called an armistice, and Germany was ready to sign one too. The Allies, led by Marshal Ferdinand Foch, came up with the agreement. It called for fighting to end, for Germany to evacuate, hand over all of its weapons, and return its prisoners. Germany signed it on the 11th of November 1918 in General Foch's railway carriage, with the armistice officially coming into effect on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. It would be the end of fighting, for a while at least. In the coming years, Germany would be forced to sign more treaties, including the Treaty of Versailles, which officially blamed Germany for the war and forced it to make big repayments to the Allies. Many historians think those terms played a big part in the rise of Hitler's Germany and the start of World War II just 20 years later. But at the time, everyone was ready for the Great War to end. News spread that the war was over.
Queensland Government Gazette, Germany has signed the armistice with the Allies, and that consequently the war that has devastated the world for more than 4 years is at an end.
The guns fell silent, and on the front lines, troops cheered and danced. In London, in Paris, in New York, people celebrated too. After more than 4 years of conflict, war was finally over.